Look, the reality is that it is often difficult to lure players to Brisbane. Players will move for opportunity, and in the case of Jackson Payne, that was the lure for him. Similarly for Trent West, from Geelong, well, clearly we needed a ruckman, given Billy was leaving the club. And Trent had probably played his best footy when he was playing that second ruck role, and that was certainly some of the feedback we got from some of the people we asked about Trent and how he'd progressed and why he perhaps hadn't played as much senior football this year. So Trent was obviously at a club where they had quite a bit of ruck depth, whereas Brisbane, it was going to give him more of an opportunity to play senior football regularly. So, and Justin's game plan includes 2 ruckmen, so it was pretty critical that we bring someone in. So again, there was the opportunity for him, and we were happy to do a trade there where we could bring him up. In terms of bargaining power, look, really the only bargaining power you have at this time of year is that you might, send a player through the pre-season draft. The other bargaining power you have is when you're able to generate a bit of competition. I mean, in the Sam Doherty case, for argument's sake, Carlton, North Melbourne had some interest, but then their interest turned to Nick Del Santo. The Bulldogs had some interest, but they weren't prepared to use their second round pick because they wanted to use that on Stuart Crameri. And so Carlton was sort of sitting there saying, well, we'll give you a third round pick now. We were able to generate a bit of competition because we did have interest in Jared Grant from the Bulldogs, and we were prepared to do a trade with the Bulldogs on that. And I think both clubs probably weren't far away on agreeing what a reasonable trade would be on that front, and that it would have been probably a player for player swap and maybe a little bit of window dressing on the back, and that kind of sharpened up Carlton's offer. Still not the level we would have ultimately liked, but it helped us to some degree. Again, with Elliot Yeo, West Coast were leading the running there, and we managed to get Fremantle to express some interest, so that prompted West Coast to readjust their offer. And probably the one player who we were strongest in terms of, well, if something can't be done, we'll either redraft or send him through the pre-season was Jared Polak. But I'd have to say Port Adelaide was the one club that did work very hard and work with us to try and get a deal that was as good as it could possibly be. The only impediment was we couldn't get a pick inside 20, which meant we could do that slide up to down to 14. So in not being able to manage that, and believe me, we tried really hard to get up the order, but clubs just weren't prepared to slide more than 3 or 4 places. So that was what got in the way of that. So that's your bargaining powers to try and generate some competition or threaten, it's pre-season draft or redraft. So that's about all you've got. We were reluctant to lock away deals in the hope that we might be able to come up with something that might get us up the order. For argument's sake, we were hanging on to pick 45 for a while because we thought, well, that could be useful in terms of packaging that with something else to move us up the order and give something back to a club, which would perhaps improve their third round selection. So there was, if you could improve a club's drafting position in the latter rounds, they might be prepared to do something, move a couple of spots in the earlier rounds. So it's really just looking at it in its totality and saying, well, if we can keep a bit of flexibility, then something else might emerge that works for us. So that was the thinking there. Jared had all along said he wanted to go home, so we were a bit disappointed when he nominated a club, and really I think that's his agents lost their nerve as much as anything else there. The trade week period is 3 weeks. That's not the club's doing. That's the AFL rules. We'd been talking to both Adelaide and Port Adelaide about a trade. And as I said, it's to our benefit to have that bit of competition. Once he nominated Port Adelaide, we did focus with Port on trying to get the best deal possible. And as I mentioned earlier, Port Adelaide were genuine in working pretty hard to do something. The issue with Adelaide was it was going to have to be a player trade, and probably the players that were being offered were maybe not the type we needed. There was one who we inquired about who we were pretty keen on, but he didn't want to move to Brisbane. We did, to be honest, we did keep talking to Adelaide, and but by the same token, we were working pretty hard with Port Adelaide. Now, the issue Adelaide had was they had no first or second round draft picks, so they traded for Bernie Vince from Melbourne for that pick 23, and perhaps if something couldn't have been done in the finish, that might have come into play. But in the end, we struck the deal with Port Adelaide, which was quite complicated, but effectively meant we were able to get the pick 22. We had to slide back a few spots down the order, but we also ended the pick 41, which we used for Trent West, was also tied up into that as well. So we kept Adelaide in the loop, but we were genuinely trying to work with Port Adelaide, who was genuine in their attempts to work with us to get the best trade possible. Well, Fremantle were probably a little bit... They got onto Elliott later, it would be fair to say. Now, I think when West Coast offered their third round pick, that left the door open for Fremantle, and we let them know about that. They were prepared to offer their second round pick, which was, I think it started off at 33 before the compensation picks, and then was, but they wanted a pick back, but 33 was obviously better than 40. Fremantle's did speak to Elliott and interview him and the like, and they at least kept West Coast honest. Personally, I would have thought Elliott was worth maybe even a slide from their first round pick, which was 17, but they weren't prepared to do that. But in the end, their interest did at least mean that West Coast offered their second round pick, which started at 24, and then after the compensation picks ended up at 28. Well, after the McAvoy trade, Billy had to reconsider his position, and we Justin, myself, Peter Swab, met with Billy and his manager. A number of players got in contact with Billy. I suppose going into the trade period, we always had a bit of a fear that St Kilda might enter the race for Billy, and our fear there was based on the fact that they were pick 3 in the draft and therefore pick 3 in the pre-season draft. So we were quite prepared to deal with Hawthorn, because the alternative, you could see that potentially St Kilda was someone who might come into play. Wasn't ideal for us. Then when the McAvoy trade went through, we thought, well, St Kilda's going to come here. So we spoke to Billy immediately afterwards. A number of players got in touch with him. I think the reality is he'd probably made up his mind, and even though he thought things through again, I think emotionally committed to going back to Melbourne. And when St Kilda came and offered him a home that was sort of meeting his needs, and he was happy to go along with that.